the BATF. BATF are the folks who are shooting up Waco, Texas right now. By the way, let me ask you a question. Those folks are supposed to be so bad, the Branch Davidians, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, maybe they have some oddball beliefs. Maybe they don't. Can I shoot you just because I don't agree with your religious belief? You can shoot them. They can shoot you too. Okay? Now, what law had those people done? What law had they broken? They hadn't broken any law. I've talked to people, law enforcement friends of mine throughout the government. They said that they can't believe it. They said it's bizarre. All the government had to do, all they had to do is get 2 assistant county sheriffs to go up and knock on the front door with a search warrant. They've done that before, and they'd let them in and let them look around. And look around. Instead, they go in with their 100 people with their ninja suits and their SWAT team, tactic.
There was a war waged on a Christian church in Waco. This is the first time there has been an armed military assault against the United States people since the Civil War.
And we ate it, didn't we?
Yeah, and the people sat back and said, oh, well, God, we got to get rid of that fanatic, those crazies out there.
Yeah,
they said, in the name of God, Time magazine, what happens when believers embrace the dark side of faith? Now, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, Koresh never went in and attacked the ATF. He had never attacked the government attacked them.
Well, there appears to be no substantiation for it. Those are allegations made by the government. But it's interesting...
and they gave the orders to slaughter... Reno gave the orders which came down from the President of the United States.
Well, the very first indictments were sealed. We still don't know what he's guilty of. No. They have sealed indictments.
As I look at Gettysburg National Cemetery and the graves here, I'm reminded of how much freedom has cost our forefathers. But I'm also reminded of those who died in Waco, Texas. But I'm also reminded of those who died in a similar incident exactly 50 years to the day before them, April 19th, 1943, in the ghettos of Warsaw, Poland. For it was in those ghettos that the Nazi stormtroopers killed the Jews living there. And the newspaper headlines were shockingly, strikingly, frighteningly the same as the headlines we saw surrounding the Waco incident. The Jews there were accused of being a strange religious sect. They were accused of performing strange sexual rites on their children. They were accused of hoarding guns and in general being a danger, a menace to society. But the similarities don't stop there. The techniques used to kill or murder these people were identical also to those in Waco, Texas. When first the stormtroopers went in a failed first attempt. Having failed in their first attempt, they called in the artillery. Poison gas was used. The people were burned alive or shot. And today, we see history repeating itself. You see, folks, if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. We see many of the same things in Nazi Germany that we see in America today.
Once our enemy succeeds, those who are controlling the New World Order, they will bring in socialism. As Orwell said, the boot on the face of humanity forever. But that won't last forever. Your real enemies are the monarchists and the people of title and nobility whom we broke away from when we wrote this document. House of Windsor, House Rothschild, Habsburg, the new Rockefellers. There is a long, long list. Have they been successful? Yes, for we have been asleep. Will they win? We shall grind them into the earth before they grind us into dust. The punishment for the actions that they have committed is high treason. Treachery most foul. Acts against our people that the founding fathers thought were so horrendous that they wrote down for posterity so that not only their enemy would see it, but so that hopefully you would remember where and when this happened. But because we have been in the new education system for so long, we are forced to suffer with repeating history once again, for we have not been taught history proper. You are doomed to repeat it again.
And CS gas, which is CS gas, of course, is what they used to murder everyone at the Waco scene. Unbeknownst to many people, the Waco invasion, they actually utilized CS gas that when it is ignited, instantly becomes cyanide. So what they did was introduce that into the building, cause it to be ignited it, and it then turned instantly into cyanide gas. Most everyone in that building, the 17 little children that were actually younger than 18 years of age, some of them, a couple of them were not even named yet, infants, they were all dead of cyanide gas. Those that ran out of the building in 2 or 3 directions were shot, systematically shot down.
Well, I found that Janet Reno, I call her Butch Reno, she already has defined who the enemies are. They're cultists. And everybody hates cultists. They burned them alive in Waco, and most of America said, great. What's next on the Sally Jesse Raphael show today? Charming. Look at those flames licking there at that building. Isn't that exciting? This is better than the latest karate movie. And of course, they couldn't hear the screams, could they, of the children in there and the babies as they burned to death and suffocated. From CS gas, by the way, that has been banned by international treaty to be used in warfare. It's okay for us to use it on children, but we couldn't use it against the Iraqis, of course. That would be breaking international law.
And what about David Koresh down in Waco, Texas at Branch Davidian? What about his religious freedom? Now, there of course are those who say that David Koresh was some sort of religious nut, and he may well have been. But frankly, I'll never know. You see, as a journalist, I would love to have interviewed David Koresh. I would love to have found out what he really stood for. But of course, I'll never have that opportunity. He and 85 others are dead at the hands of the federal government. When Janet Reno moved in, April 19th, 1993, she said it was to protect the children, the 25 children at Branch Davidian. She said that they were being sexually abused. She said that these people were hoarding guns and that they were a strange religious cult. Well, there are many things, many facts that would dispute that. You see, the state of Texas, the Child Welfare Division there, had been into the compound many times. They had found no evidence of abuse, sexual, physical, mental, or any other kind of abuse. In fact, they found these children bright, well-adjusted, well-educated. They loved learning and had a particular zeal for books. Doesn't sound like molested children to me. They said that they, the government, Janet Reno, had to go in to protect these children. Well, I ask you, protect them from what? Sounds to me like the only protection they really needed was from Janet Reno and the BATF and the FBI. You see, as the assault began, they pumped for 6 hours CS gas into Branch Davidian. CS gas, by the way, is not a tear gas as we were told in the media. It is a battlefield chemical warfare weapon banned by 130 nations by treaty, including the United States. We won't even use this stuff against Saddam Hussein, but yet we'll use it against David Koresh at Branch Davidian. 25 children died, according to the Washington Times, according to local newspapers. The last hour and a half of these children must have been a final hell, knowing what this gas does to young lungs and young bodies. As their lungs shut down, quit functioning, as they involuntarily have their eyes closed, as their lungs burn and explode. We had to protect these children from what? We had to protect these children, I think, from Janet Reno, the BATF, and the FBI. Now, what about the rest of the charges? That they were hoarding guns. Every gun they had, according to many sources, was legally registered. In fact, when the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, went into the gun shop where David Koresh bought his weapons and munitions, they found that every one of the guns he had purchased there had all of the paperwork completed on it. In addition to that, while he was there, the gun store owner called David Koresh. They offered at Branch Davidian to let the BATF come out, examine their weapons, examine the guns that they had, to find out if there were anything illegal going on. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms refused the invitation. They said they had to do something. It was a last-ditch effort. What they didn't tell us, it was this, that they had been practicing this invasion for over a year. An almost exact scale replica of Branch Davidian. They said that this was a strange religious cult. Well, it may well have been, but you see, the people in town didn't know because they weren't bothering anyone with what they were doing. They weren't out kidnapping kids. They weren't out capturing children. They weren't out doing anything to anyone. Were they a strange religious cult? It's frankly difficult to tell because they weren't bothering anyone.
It's a statement reportedly made by Attorney General Janet Reno during an interview on 60 Minutes. She allegedly defined a cultist as one who has a strong belief in the Bible and the second coming of Christ, who frequently attends Bible studies, who has a high level of financial giving to a Christian cause, who homeschools their children, who has accumulated survival foods, and has a strong belief in the Second Amendment, and who distrusts government.
Well, here's another article. I've got several, in fact, one from Don McIlvaney's intelligence advisor. Here's another one from another newspaper. Attorney General Janet Reno compiles lists. Christians and patriots viewed as potential terrorists. That's you. In late February or early March 1984, Attorney General Janet Reno issued a confidential memo to the Justice Department and the U.S. attorneys calling for an investigation against, quote, right-wing and fundamentalist Christians. The secret memo, signed by Janet Reno personally, was sent to U.S. attorneys in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Idaho, Montana, and Washington State.
Okay, now, all of this was kind of by way of introduction. Let me get on to the meat of my talk now, which is to talk about, it's all been humorous now. Now it's not going to be so humorous. Let's talk about the Fourth Reich toward an American police state. America's beginning to look more and more like Nazi Germany of the early 1930s or the Soviet Union from the 20s through the 30s. True criminals, murderers, rapists, burglars, robbers, etc., are given light or negligible sentences, while the government is now reclassifying honest, law-abiding citizens or Americans as criminals, including pro-lifers, and giving them severe jail sentences or confiscating their assets or property via draconian Nazi Marxist-Leninist-style seizure laws. The legal system in the government now allows that the have-nots to plunder the haves or to take the assets away from the haves. Okay, we're looking at a gargantuan U.S. government that's passing tens of thousands of new regulations each year. Last year there were 2,500 new bills or laws passed by the Congress, 2,500. Now, those were things that used to be okay. Now they're against the law. Okay? They then turn around and they take those new laws and they hand them over to the various government agencies. These alphabet agencies that are staffed by a couple 100,000 faceless bureaucrats that we've never seen, but they're always there. Okay? Places, people like the IRS, the SEC, OSHA, the FDA, the EPA. They take these various government agencies and they hand these laws down to them and they write regulations to implement the laws. Okay? Tens of thousands of new regulations each year. 67,700 pages of these regulations in fine print last year to control every aspect of your lives. You would have to have had a battery of Philadelphia lawyers to read and interpret and understand them, but you were held responsible for every single one of those regulations, and every single one of you in this room is now a criminal because you are in violation of some of those regulations and you don't even know it. But you see, in the United States, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So just as they did in Nazi Germany, they're passing all kinds of laws, rules, and regulations which there are no way that you can ever understand or live by them. Some of them are even in conflict with one another. You obey this one, you violate this one. So that they can, by their own whim, they can determine who is a criminal and who is not.
The highest number coming against agents of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The left-leaning America's Watch group accuses them of, quote, appalling misconduct, end quote, including shootings, torture, and beatings. The documenting of many such federal cases led groups from across the political spectrum, from the ACLU to the NRA, to join together. Last year, in a letter to President Clinton, they asked for an independent commission to investigate abuses by federal agents and put an end to what they called the erosion of American civil liberties. These groups are worried by several trends. One is that more and more federal agencies, 53 at last count, have now been given the authority to carry arms and arrest citizens.
Forest Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and others are rapidly increasing the number of gun-carrying federal agents on their staffs.
Idaho Senator Larry Craig says it was never supposed to be this way.
Our founding fathers were very cautious not to put law enforcement in the hands of the federal central government.
Another concern, so many new federal laws being created. At the start of the nation's history, there were only 3 federal laws you could break. Now there are more than 3,000. You can also get in legal trouble for disobeying any one of some 300,000 federal regulations. Another area of concern, the militarizing of federal agencies, as was seen during the raids in Waco when the feds attacked with tanks and battering rams and sprayed CS gas into the compound, a gas forbidden by international treaty even for use in war. A public policy specialist in this area, David Kopel of the Independence Institute, warns that a trademark of totalitarian regimes is law enforcement becomes heavily militarized. A related concern, the use of the military itself for law enforcement, like in recent weeks in Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, where National Guard troops have been policing and patrolling crime-ridden districts. Could this be a blueprint for future use of military units across the U.S.? And why worry about it?
Soldiers aren't trained to arrest a person, to apprehend a person, or to investigate a person with concern for their constitutional rights.
The ACLU points out a sign of repressive regimes is they always use their militaries to enforce the law, and it's one of the chief concerns of the citizen militias that have organized in nearly every state, a fear they may have to someday fight a military enforcing the illegal orders of a U.S. tyrant or dictatorial one-world government.
I mentioned to you earlier that, in fact, the police agency are being supplied with military equipment. Well, in Puerto Rico, I'm going to show you some amazing footage, because what they're doing there, which is what they're doing in Fresno, and they're doing it in New Orleans, and they're doing it in several, like in Chicago, and they're expanding this all over the country. This is, in fact, the equivalent of martial law. They're utilizing National Guardsmen. They're hammering doors in with no warrants whatsoever. They're doing full sweeps. They're going door to door, slamming people down in the dirt.
45, we are here to protect.
They never presented a single search warrant or arrest warrant to anybody.
2 states that are requesting information what we're doing, and we're going to explain to them what we are doing in Puerto Rico.
But people would ask them, why are you entering my apartment? What is your warrant? They would say, this is my warrant.
This shows a police car in San Francisco, California, but it's just not your ordinary police car. The patch on the door and the patch on the shoulder says Federal Protective Service. I think creeping gradualism is really on the gallop here. This document is from your state of Washington. Here's the sheriff's new squad car. I think that's a 114, armored personnel carrier. While the sheriff's department SWAT team runs alongside in their cami clothes, the tank rolls along to the local neighborhood raid. Now, New York is doing theirs a little bit different. Apparently, the people can't tell that this is an odd vehicle roaming around. Doesn't this look just like Germany or Russia? This is the bottom picture here is the turret on top. This is a four-wheel drive bash-in-your-door vehicle. And it's also the sheriff's new squad car. This is from Erie County Sheriff's Department, New York, August of this year. So what in the world is going on?
Additionally, some of the other more bizarre bits and pieces in terms of the reality of the attack on the United States citizenry is, of course, what I would refer to as the militarization of our police forces. They're slowly moving in, as you can see here. This is shows you in Fresno, California, where the SWAT team, which is part of the regular police force, stopping vehicles and searching people, they're now wearing full military fatigues and carrying machine guns on their side. This is in the United States, in Fresno. Additionally, as you can see here in Everett, Washington, the police forces all over the country, and this is a good example from Everett, are now receiving armored personnel carriers. This is the sheriff's vehicle that you're looking at right here, which is an armored personnel carrier, and the folks that are training on the left side, those are not military personnel. That is the sheriff's department for Snohomish County. Our understanding is that they have 2 of these units now, as well as several helicopters available close by that they can utilize. In Bay City, Michigan, the police have been supplied with hand grenades and grenade launchers and CS gas. In New Orleans, they are now carrying on what they call sweeps, where they are using actually part of the military helping them in some places. In Chicago, they're doing the same thing, as you can see from some of these pictures we're showing you right now. So right away, you got to say, what's wrong with that? It's like the armament of our police officers being armed with military materials and equipment. I'm going to show you a brief tape here. Right here, you'll see a little bit of footage. This will amaze you. This is some of the elite SWAT team. Go look at these characters. Well, this is really something. As you can see, these guys are these are the guys that are supposed to go in under extreme stress emergency configurations. These guys are dancing around their own rap tune. Watch this for a minute.
Now we're kicking it live. We're gonna rock the mic. Gonna bust it. Say, face down, ass up. That's the way we like to cuff. Oh yeah, pose.
Have you ever been out on a date with a chick and the only thing was on your mind was sex? What do you do, 31? Get down on it. How you doing? Get down on it. Jump 14, 21. Get down on it. Break down. Get down on it. Once again. Get down on it. Get down on it. Now. Get down on it.
That was pitiful.
Well, so much for that stuff, I guess. That's in a case of an emergency, you may not want to dial 111. It's sort of like just turn on the local rap station, and these guys will crawl out from under the rock and come over and dance in your front yard unless they decide to just kick in your door.
Today, CBN News begins a special 2-day series of reports on this growing fear of the federal government. In the first report, CBN News senior correspondent Gary Lane examines a few of the incidents which have sparked concerns across the nation.
Imagine it's late at night. A noise at your front door awakens you from a sound sleep. It's not a burglar, but federal agents invading your privacy, conducting another raid. Sound like something from the movies or from television? A number of diverse groups, from the NRA to the ACLU, say they're real and they're happening. They're expressing concerns about federal police agency abuses from California to Connecticut, even here in Ohio.
They weren't wearing jack boots, but, you know, when you act the way they did, they were definitely thugs.
Meet Louis Katona of Bucyrus, Ohio, part-time police officer, Eagle Scout, entrepreneur, and gun collector. His home was raided by Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents in May 1992.
No, they pretty much were running through the house yelling, "Where's the guns, where's the guns," looking for a place for the guns. And once the one agent saw the vault door here, he assumed they were behind that.
So you open this up and...
They pushed me out of the way and they rushed right on in.
Katona claims the agents used foul language during the raid and even shoved his pregnant wife Kim into a wall, an action which the Katonas say caused the miscarriage of their baby. The ATF says that claim is without foundation. The Katonas are suing the federal government for damages.
Well, it's horrible. You know, somebody's really broken into my house, as far as I'm concerned, and assaulted my wife, killed a baby, and what ended up being nothing.
When I lost the baby, that's when I thought, you know, maybe it's best that I lost the baby because, you know, with everything we're going to be going through. So I guess I just took it as maybe that was a sign that it was going to go bad, you know, that I would lose Lewis too.
6 months after the Katonas filed their suit against ATF, Lewis was indicted by a federal grand jury. He was charged with falsifying ATF gun transfer forms. Robert Sanders, former assistant director of ATF for criminal enforcement, was one of Katona's lawyers.
At the conclusion of the government's case, the judge said there is no case. You haven't stated a single offense against this man. Where's the beef?
Katona was acquitted, and another judge ordered ATF to return the guns it had seized. Despite his innocence, the cost of the ATF raid on the Katonas, more than $250,000 in legal fees and other expenses. But more importantly, say the Katonas, they lost a son or daughter they will never know. The Katonas are not alone. Complaints of abuse and mistreatment at the hands of federal agents are popping up all across America. In Poway, California, Donald Carlson is shot by Drug Enforcement Administration agents during a raid on his house. No drugs are found, but Carlson spends nearly 2 months in intensive care fighting for his life. Near Malibu, California, Donald Scott is shot and killed at his ranch. DEA agents participating in the raid claim marijuana plants were seen growing on Scott's property. None are found. In Portland, Oregon, Janice Hart is detained for hours while her home is ransacked. ATF agents raid the wrong house, mistaking Ms. Hart for someone else. And in St. Louis, Missouri, 21-year-old Monique Montgomery is shot 4 times by ATF agents searching for drugs. They find nothing. Montgomery is suing.
Without further ado, it is my privilege and honor to introduce Mark Kornke from Michigan. Mark is nationally known freedom fighter, a former member of the Army Intelligence Corps. He was educated at the University of Michigan and received grants from NASA. Mark also benefited from specialized intelligence training from the United States government. He is fluent in the language of the intelligence community. His insights are drawn from a wealth of personal experiences and private intelligence research. Mark has documented the presence of foreign troops and equipment on U.S. soil and has researched the connection between various high-ranking officials and the so-called New World Order. Mark, we welcome you to the great Northwest and welcome you with a great big round of applause. Thank you for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, the New World Order has a Third Reich odor. I think there's no doubt in anybody's mind. We have, over the last 2 years, done everything we can to inform the American people, you, and many people in the other 49 commonwealths and states, of the activities of the New World Order. Yes, I'll say it, even if Rush Limbaugh won't. One of the more recent elements that we did not have information at the time because the Gorite was not in place, nor the Clintonistas, is the fact that we have a new mechanism called, and listen to this, tell me where this sounds like it belongs, the Directorate of Central Law Enforcement. Da 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 da, right? Sounds like it should be over in Moscow. Well, it's not. The first year and a half of Al Gore's vice presidency, his job was to create an umbrella organization that envelops all of the secret police forces, or alphabet soup agencies as we call them, of the United States, and bring them under one fist. CIA, FBI, DEA, DIA, everybody including the Secret Service, brought under one umbrella to create a central KGB, I mean National Police Force. That's right. What kind of countries have centralized national police forces? Tyrants have centralized national police forces. Tyranny, kings, monarchs. Yeah, Benito Mussolini. Mao Zedong. Take your pick of names. You've seen 100 stories all over the nation, if you've seen one, about, for instance, the ATF kicking in doors to homes, shooting people or killing people, and then saying, oh, I'm sorry, wrong address. Yeah, wrong address. You and I do that, that's called murder. In Boston, because of a tip or an informant via the ATF 1-800 number, 1-800-ATF-GUNS, if you don't know that number, write it down. I call it every chance I get when I pass a payphone. And you should too. In Boston, these gentlemen got an anonymous tip, and this tipster, of course, makes money on the deal, gets 25% of whatever they confiscate, if they confiscate anything, and they always confiscate something because we have booty laws now. Like pirates, like the buccaneers of the high seas. You go storm somebody's house and swing across from the other mast, you get to carry away his piano. Oh, I'm sorry, that's like Germany. You get to take his food. Oop, that's like Russia. You get to grab his rice. Oh, that's communist China. Whoops. Well, the fact of the matter is they kicked in the door on a second-floor apartment, burst into the man's house. It was a 54-year-old black minister. They beat him, pushed him to the ground, stomped on him, harassed him verbally. I mean, we're not talking harassed, we're talking, they swore at him. Shoved him to the ground, shackled him, he had a heart attack and died. They had the wrong place. Oh, you know what they said? Oh, we're sorry. They proceeded to leave immediately to try and find another location to kick another door down. And what was their favorite uniform for these guys? Well, the black uniform, the same black uniform that the SS used, the same black uniform that before the SS ever showed up, and after the SS was dust in Berlin in 1945, the KGB has also used for 70-plus years. Ladies and gentlemen, what does black denote in the West with regard to for uniforms or for equipment, or the color itself, the way it's used here? It's a symbol of terror. It's designed to terrify you, to drive you into submission. That's why the KGB uses it. That's why the SS used it. Well, it's a spiffy color too, nice threads, I imagine. But the problem here is you'll see that 90% of the time these guys now either cover their badges or have no badges. They have no name tapes. They wear the black ski mask, and all you see are the eyes. And why do they do that? Because the eyes are the wells to the soul. What kind of a person are you dealing with? You need to only look into the eyes to find out what you're dealing with. In 1975, when I was in the military, if you saw a guy in a ski mask, you were trained to shoot him. He was a terrorist. In 1995, when you see him, he's a government employee. And still a terrorist, of course. That's why, whenever I go through an airport, and because we are paranoid and crazy, well, every once in a while I start to shake and I get this fear inside me, and so I go to the payphone and I dial that 1-800-ATF number. And when I hear that loving voice of that secret policeman who'd like to kick down my door, I mean that federal employee who's just there to help me, and I hear that voice and I hang up because I feel more comfortable. But even as I do that, I walk away from the phone and begin to become fearful again, and I realize that there's a phone right next to the one I just used. And so I call again, and I hope that I get a different person. And sometimes I don't say anything at all. And other things, I just ask them why they're the murderers and butchers that they are and hang up. Remember, they're from the government, and they're here to help. I'll help that 800 number right into the ground. To give you an idea, though, and I got awfully nervous when we were in Dallas. You ever seen how big Dallas Airport is? We had a layover for 3 hours in Dallas, and we started at the first station in the airport. We had to go to Station 43. Do you know how many payphones there are between Station 1 and Station 43? And I always let the kids help because I want them to feel comfortable too. So when we go to a gas station, the very first thing that happens is all the kids jump out of the car and run for the payphones. Now, I don't know what they're doing, and I'm not trying to give anybody ideas, but I can imagine they might be doing things that they're not supposed to. And an 800 number is a lot of fun to call because it doesn't cost you anything. And remember, please, don't do this at home. Okay? No, I didn't make any calls here at all. Okay, remember, they have caller ID too.
Job, but since the advent of the head of the Justice Department, Janet Reno, things have gotten out of control, and something is going on that is just very unwholesome in this nation. And you look for an explanation of this craziness in Oklahoma City, and a lot of it goes right back to what happened to the Branch Davidians and Randy Weaver and these other people. I mean, the West is in an uproar about what's happening. I mean, it's happening more in the West than it is in the urban areas of the East. And those western states are just really seeking relief for what's been done. This is a shocking abuse of federal power. It's reminiscent of the Nazis, and something has got to be done. What do you have now?
The Washington Times today, Washington Tuesday, July the 11th, has a very interesting article, Racist Ways Die Hard at Lawmen's Retreat. And it's talking about some of the things that took place at an ATF retreat, what they call a good old boys roundup. And here are just a few of the items that you could buy at the ATF roundup. T-shirts with Martin Luther King's face behind a target. White D.C. police officer with a black man sprawled across the hood of their car under the words, "Boys on the Hood." Nigger hunting licenses were also available. And that's just a few of them. Well, that's what it says here.
You don't suppose?
No. This is probably just some more of that right-wing propaganda from the news media. Well, yesterday, we told you about a whites-only gathering of law enforcement officers in Tennessee. This gathering had been organized by members of the Federal Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. The Washington Times reported that the event was full of displays of racism. Well, the head of the ATF, John McGaugh, tells the Times that he is appalled by the news of this annual event and that the ATF's Office of Inspection will conduct an investigation. CBN News will keep you posted on that investigation.
These people can care less. Some of them can care less who they work for, provided they get a big paycheck and they got lots of excitement. The big thing right now everybody's heard about is dynamic entry. Dynamic entry means go in, kill everybody, even the hostages. Ignore everything other than kill, kill, kill. Identify whether or not you have any wounded on your side. Collect all intelligence data. Finish off any wounded and leave. That's dynamic entry that they're teaching local law enforcement right now. That's a fact. We've been to Florida, we've been to Montana, and in both cases we had police officers come forward. They are teaching them dynamic entry in Florida for even the local law enforcement.
Hi, everybody. Hello there. Chuck Harder for the People. With me here at the center in White Springs, Jeff Baker. Jeff, are you there?
I'm here.
All right, your microphone is on. Larry Pratt is in the Washington, D.C. studio. Larry, are you there?
Hello again.
Hiya. The land of the free, the home of the brave, and now it's a crime bill. What is this crime bill taking away from us, Jeff Baker?
I think it would be easier to tell you what it's leaving us, and that is nothing except the ability to take orders from a federalist dictatorship that, you know, it's interesting, Chuck. It used to be that the patriots were in Washington and the crooks were in jail. My, how things have changed, huh?
All right, Larry Pratt, what's your read on this crime bill?
Well, in addition to the banning of guns, which obviously is unconstitutional, the other police state aspects that one can point to regarding the Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections that are being blown away and the federalization of the police. By the way, when we talk about federalization of the police, what we're talking about is funding coming from Washington, whether it's for 100,000 officers, whether it's 100, whether it's full funding, whether it's partial, but accountability moves to Washington along with that money. Mm-hmm. And the end result of this process will be just as it has been in education or in medicine or in all of these other areas where the federal government's got its toehold to start with. We're going to end up, in the case of law and order, with the Attorney General of the United States being our local chief of police. And right now, that means Janet Reno.
Isn't that a frightening thought, Larry, to think that Butch Reno is now the chief of police and the sheriff in every city and county and hamlet in this nation under this bill? I mean, this is frightening to me to think that somebody with her worldview is in fact in charge of what goes on. I mean, colleges have already proven this. If there's state money or federal money involved, the federal government has control. Even private schools have found that if they take federal dollars, this is what happens. Now, your local police department is in the clutches of Butch Reno and her Justice Department. This is a frightening thought to me.
It's happening already because out in Colorado, a Christian school was just raided. 25 uniformed officers apparently did whatever you call a dynamic entry raid. Wake, you know, I mean, now they didn't shoot any guns, thank God.
But they did have guns drawn when they went in.
All right, and here you had 25 uniformed officers to raid a Christian school.
Those kindergartners there are pretty dangerous, I'm sure.
12 children and 2 adults, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, the Gestapo outnumbered the kids and the adults almost 2 to 1. Can you, and the children were terrified. Can you imagine little children looking up and seeing the Gestapo arriving, you know, to raid the school?
Now, what I just sent circulating, you're going to see different pieces, and we're going to get into this very quick. I just want to touch on it. The photograph that you see of the soldiers, I'm sorry, police, whatever, that are kicking in the door in this one scene, were in the San Francisco papers. When we were out in California, we happened to be in the right place at the right time. This report was offered to the AP Wire Service, and they refused it. They did not print it anywhere else in the country. The people that you see there are Russian combat troops and secret police being trained with the San Francisco PD in dynamic entry, house-to-house search and seizure. Now, dynamic entry is what was used at Waco and is also used in many parts of the country. There is a new component to dynamic entry called total kill option, in which they are ordered to shoot the cats, the dogs. If there were supposedly hostages or prisoners, shoot them, shoot the women, shoot the kids, shoot everybody, and leave. And then somebody else as a second team comes in to assess the damage and pick up the pieces. Now, for anybody who doubts that, there are 3 different articles in 3 different law enforcement magazines talking about the use of total kill option. So it is out there.
Here's a news report. This comes from the Wisconsin Report. Has a picture. Says, San Francisco cops teach Russians to fight crime. Here they are in their ski mask with their machine guns and all, and they're practicing housebreaking and house-to-house searches. We're teaching the Russian cops how to break into people's homes.
We have a police force in North Carolina. Right below their police department sign, it says, "Welcome, Russian police." Wow. What's going on there? This was March of '95.
The people in, what was it, San Francisco? The bank raid. Southern California, maybe it might have been Los Angeles, correct us, we can get you a copy of the document. In Southern California, a special urban assault unit was given permission, or apparently had permits, to practice against an empty building. What they chose from the air was a bank. They repelled, they attacked, they fought their way into this thing, they repelled and crashed through windows, they put people on the ground, they were attacking this place in force, and everybody in the bank started calling 911. Oh my God, there's black helicopters out there. The first response they got was, "Ma'am, there are no black helicopters." And he said, "Well, if that's the case, then who the hell's outside our window right now?" Then, of course, they said, "Well, it's okay, ma'am, it's a training exercise, and they have a permit to do this." And I'm sure everybody kind of looked at the phone and said, "What?" So they do make mistakes, and they come out in the public's eye, and very quickly they'll make it disappear. That is typically the case 90% of the time. Yes, they attacked the wrong building. They didn't go for the empty one. They went for one with the money.
I was terrified. I thought the men were going to kill me. The first thing I did was say, "Please don't hurt my children." My 10-year-old son was in the house.
Judy Peroni and her husband Andy say 75 federal agents from at least 8 different federal agencies converged on their Trout Creek, Montana property one day in September 1993. They say many were wearing camouflage and were brandishing automatic weapons.
Well, they came up and grabbed me and threw me physically on the ground right here in the gravel and breaking the tops of my 2 front teeth off. I was accused of being a white supremacist, Yes, they searched my place. I think they ended up expecting to find drugs, automatic weapons, explosives, things like this. And they found nothing. They basically had a lot of egg on their face.
Andy's son, J.R., explains how he reacted to federal agents pointing automatic weapons in his face.
And I cried with my grandmother for quite a while because, you know, I was scared just witless totally.
Judy Peroni was 2.5 months pregnant at the time, and like Kim Katona, she miscarried her baby following the incident. She blamed stress and emotional upset caused by the raid.
I don't believe anything else could have caused it. How could somebody come in with guns on you one day and with such force, with the force that they came in on me with the guns, and to lose the baby the next day is just too coincidental.
Andy Peroni was convicted and served 10 months in prison. The government argued Andy knew his neighbor was growing marijuana, but failed to report him. Tanya Metaxa of the National Rifle Association.
This country has gone overboard in these break down the door, jump into people's faces types of arrests. And it's going to get some people killed who shouldn't be killed.
One of the most notorious examples of a raid gone awry occurred at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, in August 1992. Bob Fletcher is a spokesman for the militia of Montana.
They utilized 250 military forces on the ground to go after Randy Weaver, to blow his poor wife's head off, and to shoot their 15-year-old son in the back.
It clearly could be an excessive use of force beyond the bounds of the Constitution.
For nearly 3 years, Senator Larry Craig of Idaho has asked his colleagues in Congress to investigate the actions of the FBI and other federal agencies at Ruby Ridge.
The issue is they're out enforcing laws that should be enforced by the county sheriff.
A congressional hearing on the Weaver incident is expected later this summer. So why is ATF and other federal agencies using military-style assault tactics when serving search warrants? Both the FBI and ATF declined to grant CBN News interviews for this story to answer that and other questions.
Over the past 2 years, as training and enforcement exercises have increased, SWAT teams in black ninja suits and other government marshals of enforcement teams have had an increasing number of shootouts with innocent victims who are characterized by the government as religious fundamentalists, as cultists, as white supremacists, as left or right-wing extremists, as tax protesters, as gun law violators, etc., etc. How many of you ever heard of Randy Weaver? Randy Weaver was a former Green Beret. A good guy, a Christian. He lived up in Idaho. The government approached him about 2 years ago, the FBI, and they said, we want you to spy on your neighbors and tell us which ones of them are collecting guns. And Randy Weaver said, I don't think that's a very good idea. I think that's kind of a ratty idea. So they said, if you don't do this, we'll get you. About 6 months later, they sent in a couple of BATF agents who posed as friends, and after a month or so of getting to know him, asked him if he would buy him some guns. He did. He bought him a couple of shotguns. They turned around and claimed that one of the shotguns was 1/4 of an inch too thin, or too short, okay? They filed federal firearms charges against him. Before he went to court, he got an anonymous call that they were planning to shoot him. And it's interesting on some of these things. There was likewise an anonymous call before the Waco incident broke out. A friend of mine in the Treasury Department thinks it's coming from someone in the government who wants to see these confrontations. In any case, he took off with his family and he went up to the woods, and he lived way up in the middle in northern Idaho in a small house. He homeschooled his kids. Strong Christian family. Until last August. In last August, a SWAT team, I believe it was made up of 7 or 8 U.S. Marshals, came onto his property. His dog ran out and started barking at him. They shot the dog. His son ran out, saw that they had shot the dog, started screaming at them. What were they doing? They shot the son and killed him, 14-year-old son. Randy Weaver and a young man that was living with him, they dragged the son back into the cabin, and this started a 10-day siege. The government flew in a helicopter loaded with napalm and was going to napalm the house when a local photographer ran out, started waving his camera in the air, and they saw that they were about to be photographed, and they turned around and went back. They arrested the photographer for obstruction of justice. They sent in an FBI sniper. They had done a computer profile on this family and concluded that the wife was the strong suit, and they've done computer profiles on all Americans, whether you know it or not. They decided that she was the one, if they could nail her, that they could probably get everybody inside to surrender. So the FBI sniper sat outside for 4 days, On the fourth day, they went over to a little shack that was right next door, about 3, 4, 5 feet away from the main house, to pray over the body of Sam, who was the 14-year-old boy. And as the wife, Vicky, opened the door with baby in arms, 10-month-old baby in arms, the sniper nailed her right between the eyes and killed her. The baby fell to the floor. The siege went on for 10 days. They finally came out. Their trial starts in 14 days. They've even accused the 10-month-old baby, the 9-year-old, and the 12-year-old daughters of criminal conspiracy to overthrow the government, of murder, and everything else. It is incredible. You say those things can't happen in the United States. I could give you dozens of stories of people I know personally that have had this happen to them.
Ladies and gentlemen, the co-author of the intelligence report, Mr. John Stadtmiller.
We ran a little bit long, so I'm going to make this real brief. How many here heard of Brunswick, Ohio? Not very many. A few. What happened there was a travesty. 300 policemen and 200 firemen showed up to take care of a man and a 9-year-old boy that didn't want an officer coming into his home because he did not have a warrant. And the press reported he was espousing crazy ramblings such as, "You're violating my constitutional rights. You do not have a warrant. You can't come in." Well, let me tell you what happened to this man. He's dead. This 9-year-old boy is dead, and he was buried last week because he said no.
There presently is a bill. Amazingly enough, the title of that, the number of that bill is 666. That bill is running through the Congress, has passed Congress. It will probably pass the Senate. That is a bill that totally eradicates, for all intents and purposes, the Fourth Amendment. They've bit into the Second Amendment by taking away your guns. They're now biting into the Fourth Amendment. This Bill 666 calls for the search and seizure of your home, your person, your property, or your business in any way, shape, form, or manner that's deemed logically appropriate by the local police. They do not need a warrant, according to 666. This bill, coincidentally, was authored and presented to the floor of the U.S. Congress just a week or so ago here in February of '95 by Bill McCollum from Florida, who coincidentally was a person that I was the candidate for Congress against in 1990. I ran against Bill McCollum in 1990 on the basis that he was running a corrupted congressional office, supplying and assisting Oliver North's programs with actually the bringing on mercenaries, hiring mercenaries onto the program in his office in the Congress, and which is the most outrageous, illegitimate use of the congressional office I could imagine. He did that back in the 80s. When I found out about it, I was in his district and I ran against him for U.S. Congress, knowing that he was running a corrupted office, and now he presents possibly one of the most flagrant attacks on the Constitution of the United States with Bill 666.
Electronic surveillance and computerization of the people is also taking place. Computers and other high-tech breakthroughs over the past few years have given the U.S. and other governments the ability to listen to, monitor, track, and keep citizens under surveillance from the cradle to the grave. It was not available to Hitler and Nazi Germany or to the communists in Russia, China, or the East Bloc, at least until very recently. Each adult American now has several dozen or more files in government computerized databases, all tied together and keyed to your Social Security number. Dozens, be careful how you throw that out. Don't use it except when you absolutely legally have to. A dozen of government agencies maintain billions of records on the American public. Computerized profiles on each adult American were assembled by the IRS between 1985 and 1990 using tax, credit card, bank, medical, employment, police, passport, and other records drawn from various government databases, private credit bureaus, etc., etc. Most phone calls, telexes, faxes, and certain U.S. mail are now regularly monitored by the federal agencies. The U.S. government is presently purchasing hundreds of fax tapping machines at $30,000 apiece. so they can fax your taps. So if you think you have private communications on the phone or faxes, think again. Phones can now be made hot on the hook. That means turned into microphones even when hung up and not in use. That technology came out of Sweden about 2 years ago. They're experimenting with it around the United States. They go down to the local little telephone switching station. They can dial up your number with a little piece of equipment, and they can listen in your house with the telephone hung up. According to a 1992 report by the General Accounting Office entitled FBI Advanced Communications Technologies Pose Wiretapping Challenges, it is the intention of the FBI to tap every phone in America. I didn't say it, the General Accounting Office said it.
Clinton has additionally called and gone into other areas to eliminate your constitutional rights. Bill Clinton has put together, as you can see here, he wants unlimited monitoring capabilities for monitoring your phone calls, your faxes, and your email through your computer system. And one of the most outrageous statements I've heard in a long time came from the head of the FBI, Mr. Free, the newly established head under Bill Clinton. He said, we are trying to combat too much privacy in the wrong hands. Too much privacy in the wrong hands, folks. What does that mean? What does that mean in the United States of America? I'm not sure I understand.
The question is, who really did the heinous, despicable bombing in Oklahoma City? Could it not have been the FBI, the CIA, orchestrated by Bill Clinton? My friends, for months before the bombing, many patriots and Christians were warning that something was about to happen. We knew something was going to happen. We knew that the government was fixing to do things. In fact, Congressman Steve Stockman of Texas and also Congressman Hansen actually sent letters to Janet Reno saying, we hear rumors that you're going to do some dramatic thing, for example, to raid militias and such. Is this true? Of course, the Justice Department denied it. Here's another one. Homegrown terror. U.S. News and World Report. Look at this poor woman with her bloody face. The little child with blood on his shirt. Homegrown terror. They don't know this to be a fact, but I believe it's a fact. I believe it is homegrown. I believe it's the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI and the BATF. Not all of the agents, not all of them are evil, but there is a hit team. There is an assassination squad. There is a special Delta Force type group involved here that carried out this bombing. I believe that. Who benefited? That's what police look at with motive. Who benefited the most? Now the New World Order has been furthered. Now there are bills for this anti-terrorism thing. There's plans to hire another 1,000 FBI agents. They want to take away our rights. Who benefits the most from the horrible slaughter in Oklahoma City?
Well, let me say, first of all, what I have done today. I've renewed my call on the Congress to pass the anti-terrorism legislation that's up there, that I've sent. I have determined to send some more legislation to the Hill that will strengthen the hand of the FBI and other law enforcement officers in cracking terrorist networks, both domestic and foreign. I have instructed the federal government to do a preventive effort on all federal buildings that we have today, and we're going to rebuild Oklahoma City. Now, over and above that, I have asked the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and the National Security Advisor to give me a set of things which would go into a directive about what else we should do. I don't want to prejudge this issue, but the nations of this world are going to have to get together, bring our best minds together, and figure out what to do about this. We have been working hard to try to get the legal support we need to move against terrorism, to try to make sure that we can find out who's doing these kind of things before they strike. But it is true that in a free society that is very open, where technological changes bring great opportunity, they also make it possible to do destructive things. And we have got to take steps aggressively to shut it down. And I'm going to do everything in my power to do just that. We do have free speech in this country, and we have very broad free speech, and I support that. But I think that free speech runs two ways, and when people are irresponsible with their liberties, they ought to be called up short, and they ought to be talked down by other Americans. And we need to expose these people for what they're doing. This is wrong. People should examine the consequences of what they say and the kind of emotions they're trying to inflame.
Thank you, Mr. President.
About this speaker, the legendary lawyer F. Lee Bailey said, "He is a person whose investigative skills are unsurpassed by anyone I know or have known." But let me share some other things about this gentleman. He was a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1951 through 1979. He first became the Special Agent Supervisor for the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. from 1960 through 1965. From 1965 through 73, he was the Assistant Special Agent in charge of New Haven, Connecticut and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From 73 to 74, he served as Special Agent in charge in Memphis, Tennessee and Dallas, Texas. And from 77 through 79, he was the Senior Special Agent in charge of the Los Angeles, California Bureau of the FBI. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Ted L. Gunderson. Ted.
Thank you very much. Ron, you have no idea how much money I had to pay F. Lee Bailey for that statement. Let me just say that there appears to be an effort, in my opinion, and this is strictly opinion, I cannot prove this, there's an element within our society that I feel has caused an incident to arouse the American people and to encourage and, in fact, insist that Congress pass anti-terrorism legislation for the purpose of further eroding our civil liberties and destroying our great Constitution. There is talk now that the FBI and the Department of Justice and the U.S. government need more anti-terrorism legislation, more manpower, more liberty to gather information, et cetera, et cetera. I have with me here the current guidelines of the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI in these type cases. I've looked at them, I've read it, I've been involved in anti-terror, in fact, I attended anti-terrorism seminars. I've been involved in counter-espionage cases. I've run the gamut in my 27 and a half years in the FBI. I assure you, 100%, these guidelines are adequate to enforce the law and to handle any terrorist situation which might occur in this country. Okay.
We must realize that tyrants and bullies need enemies. They need scapegoats. It was February the 27th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler had his own henchmen secretly burn down the Reichstag building in Berlin. This could be an event similar to the Oklahoma City bombing. Now consider what happened. Hitler had been elected to office by a democratic country. In other words, a free vote had put him in office. But because it was a democracy with a constitution, he was not able to exercise and wield his bully powers as a tyrant and a dictator. What he needed was a dramatic event. What he needed was scapegoats and enemies. And so what he had his henchmen do, his brown shirts, in the dead of night, was to go to the Reichstag building. Now this was a building that I guess our only equivalent would be the White House or the U.S. Capitol building. And he had them bomb it, you might say, firebomb it, set a fire, and burn it to the ground. And then Hitler began to make speeches crying out for law and order. He said, "We will find the perpetrators. We will give them the maximum punishment." And finally they found the guilty party, so-called, and they had a people's show trial of this young man. It reminds me, perhaps, of what might be happening in this case. And even with the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, they found their patsy. We did not know until years later, after World War II, that Hitler had invented the entire event. He burned down the Reichstag building, and then he blamed it on his enemies.
Okay, now I need to tell you and introduce my associate. This is Suzanne Harris. She and I have been friends and associates and worked together for years. She has taught law. She has a degree in political science. I've been on radio talk shows with her, and she's made it a point as a loyal American and dedicated citizen to review and follow legislation that is being introduced and in some instances unfortunately passed in Washington, D.C. She's going to discuss this with you for the next few minutes. Come on, Suzanne.
So we knew by the middle of last year that there was going to be probably something called a Reichstag fire episode. And those of you who know about Nazi history probably understand that that means an explosive political episode, terrorist episode, calculated to buffalo the people into accepting the giving up of their rights. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that throughout the 20th century, most totalitarian regimes have come into place through the voluntary acquiescence of the people. Surprisingly enough, more liberty is lost through the ballot box than through tanks. Right? So what you have to understand is what are the signs, what are the kinds of techniques that are used to create these episodes. We figured by the middle of last year there was going to be a Reichstag fire, there was going to be an episode calculated to try to catapult the American people into a state of panic where they would give up their freedom in favor of tyranny. By early this year, we figured out that the likely target group, that is the likely bad guy in this scenario, would be the militia. And for those of you who say, well, we think the militia did it, I can only say that's fine if you want to believe that, but use a little logic. In basic criminology, who do you look at, first of all, when you're looking for the culprit? Try the guy who benefits. Who benefits from Oklahoma City? Not the people, not the militia, but the government. Right? Now, this year, in February, out came the key. That is the terrorism bill that makes sense of why you would have a Waco episode or why you would have an Oklahoma City episode. In February, President Clinton had introduced in the Senate a bill called Senate 390. Its House analog is H.R. 896. The bill was so repulsive on its face that the man assigned the task of introducing it, Senator Biden, gagged as he introduced it and said in the congressional record that the bill, he was doing it because the president commanded him to do it, but that he was severely troubled by the bill because of the use of secret tribunals and the loss of liberty that it represented. Now, what this bill does is it sets the concept of due process of law and liberty back about 1,000 years. The one thing that's unique about Senate 390 is that when you compare it to the comparable legislation in Germany, this one's worse. Now, people will tell you, senators and congressmen will tell you not to worry, this bill just deals with foreigners. It's an anti-abuse of the immigration code bill, and it's calculated to get people like the Palestine Liberation Organization terrorists, or the IRA, out of our country. Don't believe it. The language of the bill is deviously clever because what it says is it defines an alien as a non-American national, and it does it in terms of the immigration code. Now, without going into the details, which are really beyond the scope of the time that I've been given to speak to you, let me simply say that the way that alien is defined in this bill would include a majority of the sovereign citizens. This ranks as the most reprehensible piece of legislation I have ever seen. Now, the catch is that when the Nazis passed stuff like this, they conducted polls because generally even totalitarians would prefer not to provoke a revolution. So the key issue now is, and I realize sometimes people say writing to Congress does no good, but this time it's going to count. The key issue now is, can we generate enough public opinion, enough public perception to stop this juggernaut, to scare the politicians, to make them realize that this is not the moment to wrap up the Constitution and burn up the Bill of Rights. If this is the last time you ever write to Congress, make it on this issue. Because if we don't convince them that the PR blitz from Oklahoma City is working, our liberties are done. So the essence of your letter has to be, don't make Oklahoma City into the Reichstag fire. We're not Germans, we won't buy it. In other words, don't think that you can create a terrorist episode and destroy our country with it.
Still another problem, according to these groups, is the executive branch making a grab for much more police power, some of it highly questionable in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing.
It shouldn't be the case that Americans have to worry that their phone could be tapped. It shouldn't be the case that Americans have to worry that their credit records could be made accessible by the FBI without them being involved in any criminal activity.
The first draft of the House anti-terrorism bill was so loose it could let authorities define as an act of terrorism, prosecutable by the federal government, everything from threatening your spouse with a gun to blocking an abortion clinic. While the anti-terrorism bills ask for sweeping new powers, the ACLU and others also worry about numerous executive orders that the public knows little about. These orders could give the president, federal agencies, and the military near dictatorial powers.
Now this man, Ted L. Gunderson, made an entire book about the bombs in Oklahoma. Here's the book. A very unique documentation on what's really going on out there. He's a former FBI chief. His last assignment was in Los Angeles, California. He had 700 men under him, an annual budget of $22 million. So the guy should know what he's talking about. He's put his reputation on the line by building this book to show America what's really going on. This man has a burning concern for his country. This is the man that did the analysis on the Oklahoma bombs from the seismic center at the Norman, Oklahoma College, which is about 16 miles away from the epicenter. He donated this documentation to Ted Gunderson to put in his book. This is what it looked like. The first one's the outside bomb. The second one is the inside, and the next also the inside. You'd have to ask yourself some very pertinent questions right about here, remembering the Twin Towers in New York and the faces of the people that came out of there gasping for air, blackened with soot all over their faces. How come you didn't see this in Oklahoma? If this was a fertilizer bomb, it should have been identical. How come there was none? And the second thing you'd have to ask, if this was the only bomb, how come pillars that should have been blown that were closer to the truck were still standing? And those that are very, very far away were taken out. Yet those pillars that were close still had the sheetrock hanging on them. It takes 30,000 psi to blow a pillar over. It takes 30 psi to take the sheetrock off, so what was the sheetrock doing there? It does not compute.
And I really became involved in this case, this bombing by accident. I was sitting in my condominium, minding my own business, and I received a fax. And would you turn the light on over there, Peter? I received a fax, and this fax was from the Oklahoma Geology Department. Turn around so we can read it, will you, Peter, please? You're going to have to sweep it across the screen. Go over to the left. That's it. Okay. From the University of Oklahoma Department of Geology. And this fax was distributed throughout the United States. And I received this, and I looked at it, and I made a phone call to the University of Oklahoma. And I asked Dr. Ken Luza, what does this mean? He said, this chart indicates there were 2 detonations in the Oklahoma City bombing. He sat on that for about a day and a half because I didn't see anything like this in the media. And I kept waiting for the media to release it. Nobody released it. And so I went from there. And it was very obvious to me that the government who claimed it was a fertilizer bomb were not telling the truth. Because fertilizer bombs do not have 2 blasts. They only have 1 blast. Now, I also recall, in retrospect, that the day of the bombing, there were some people who claimed that they heard 2 blasts, but you heard it the first day and you didn't hear it among the media after that. And then, according to CNN, 2 or 3 days later, there was a meeting taking place in one of the buildings 3 blocks away, and in that meeting they had a tape recorder on, and they claimed that there were 2 blasts. So I feel it's been fairly well documented that there were 2 detonations. And I might also mention that the people who went in on the 21st and talked to Dr. Luza told me that ABC News had been in and talked to the University of Oklahoma, and numerous other representatives from the media had been in there, and yet we still have not received this information officially from the press. So in conclusion, I feel very comfortable in stating that the government is not telling the truth, and it's very obvious that there is an organized disinformation program directed at the militia.
The information you're about to see, much of which has gone unreported until now, will shake the very foundation of the government's cover story about what happened in the Morrow Building in Oklahoma City on the morning of April the 19th, 1995. The news staffs of ABC TV and radio, CNN, Associated Press, as well as those of Time and Newsweek magazines, have known most of these facts for several months. They have chosen to ignore everything that does not seem to further incriminate the FBI's designated guilty parties.
Some time ago, a number of calls came into our network here at White Springs that indicated something was very wrong in the Oklahoma bombing matter. Families of the victims spoke out. They said things were not as the national media was portraying supposed facts. We started looking into the Oklahoma bombing and became more and more concerned, to the point where we commissioned this team to take cameras, investigators, and reporters to Oklahoma City and elsewhere to try to put the pieces together. What follows now is their report.
Hi, I'm Pat Shannon. Over the past 5 months, I have had 5 separate trips back to Oklahoma City to investigate those mysterious bombings. In our private investigative circles, we refer to the bombings, plural, because while indeed there may have been an explosion in a Ryder rental truck outside on the street that morning, there also were multiple explosions inside the building. Now, why the federal investigators and the establishment media refuse to acknowledge these facts, we cannot say. Why the BATF refused to answer any questions? For 35 days, they were challenged on no one being in their offices that morning. J.D. Cash is an investigative reporter whom I had the good fortune to meet on my second trip to Oklahoma, and who has worked very closely with me on this case. He is a lawyer who at age 40 retired from his business in Tulsa with enough means to pursue his long-suppressed desire to be a writer. When the explosions in Oklahoma City captured his attention, he immediately began to investigate the discrepancies in the accepted story, the single blast theory.
J.D., how many people have you actually spoken with who heard multiple explosions that morning?
I have talked to so many people who have heard multiple explosions that I have really lost count. We call them the Two Blast Club. Actually, it's no longer a point of dispute, especially when you're interviewing someone who has a military background. Those are the people who have, especially combat veterans who have been under fire. They're very attuned to explosives. I even talked to a demolition expert who was sitting in a cafeteria in Edmond, some 30 miles from the blast site. And it is his custom, when he hears a blast, to use his feet to count the subsequent blast, to check for it. And he says there was no question there were 2 blasts that day.
Ted Gunderson is a retired senior special agent in charge of the Los Angeles office of the FBI. Today, he's a private investigator, and renowned trial attorney F. Lee Bailey once dubbed him as unsurpassed by any in the country.
This all doesn't make sense. And now the latest thing, as of this date, is that these are 2 guys, McVeigh and Nichols, out having a beer, decided they hate the government, went down there and blew up the federal building. That's a joke.
Why are the national media ignoring this real information that appears to be factual that you and General Parton and others are uncovering? They're ignoring you, and they are chasing this apparent folly.
I don't think they're chasing anything. I think this is part of the disinformation program.
Ted, it appears that the only way people are able to get the truth from this whole fiasco is from the underground network, so to speak. It seems that even the people in the highest echelons of government are participating in some kind of cover-up. Do you agree with that?
I agree 100%.
Brigadier General Ben Parton of Alexandria, Virginia. He holds a Distinguished Service Medal. He's twice received the Legion of Merit. He was a distinguished graduate of the Air War College. He holds 2 master's degrees and is a candidate for a PhD. His expertise over most of his 31-year career in the United States Air Force was demolition, and he headed up the Explosives Research Laboratory for the Air Force. He knows how buildings fall and what the identifying signs are as evidence of detonation after they have fallen. He could tell immediately, from nothing more than pictures in magazines, that the American people were not being told the truth about the Oklahoma City tragedy.
And here is the stub of column B3. And the top of that column is at the 3rd floor level. And if you examine that column closely, you can see that the rebar is still sticking out the top, and it has all the appearance of a demolition charge, the kind of damage you get from a demolition charge at the top of that column, where it had a juncture with floor number 3.
General, would you explain to us the particulars, what your message is? What are you trying to get across?
Well, I'm trying to show, with this layout of the building structure, the pattern of damage that was done to the building from whatever was doing damage. And what I found that you had demolition charges in the building plus the truck bomb outside. Now this is the pressure pattern that you would get from the truck bomb located at this position. And that's about the size of the explosive charge of 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate with enough fuel on it. And even though you had about 500,000 pounds out here per square inch, by the time that pressure wave got to the first point of contact with the building was right here, you're down to about 375 pounds per square inch.
Now the columns with the X's you've marked are on the third floor.
The columns with the X's I marked are the columns that I concluded were taken out by demolition charges.
At the third floor level?
At the third floor level.
Pat Shannon asked General Barton if this could have been a staged event in order to accelerate the passage of anti-terrorism legislation currently before Congress, which, if passed, would undermine American civil rights. These are his conclusions.
They were federalizing crime in this country when the Constitution clearly leaves it in the local level, in the state level. They were giving the FBI and the BATF and any law enforcement agency in this country powers over the American people that the American people had never seen before. It's the same kind of power over the people that the Gestapo in Germany was exercising and the KGB in Russia were exercising. And I just didn't want to see that imposed on the people in this country.
There were other innocent victims of this tragedy. First, the President and the Attorney General jumped to outrageous conclusions and seemed to make whatever public accusations that might prove to be politically expedient. They blamed in general the Christian right, and in particular the conservative talk show hosts and the unorganized state militia.
Did you see the recent vote for Janet Reno, the new Attorney General? Janet Reno, I've talked to a man named Jack Thompson and others in Miami who are very close to the situation. Jack Thompson ran as U.S. Attorney down there against her, or State's Attorney, I guess. And Jack Thompson and a number of other people down there have a great deal of evidence as to our new Attorney General's lesbian background. This is a woman who basically is pro-gun control. She is pro-socialism in every single way. She is a radical leftist. It didn't hurt that she was also a buddy of Hillary's. And she was voted in 98-0. That means that every single conservative and every single Republican in the Senate voted for her. I don't know who the two were who abstained.
Good evening. What can I say about Jack Thompson? I think the best thing I can tell you about Jack is what real persecution is all about. Jack's an attorney, and who recognized during the interrogation that what Jack Thompson did in his opposition to pornography and his opposition to the sort of thing that was happening on the radio station was based in his Christian beliefs. I was pleased to be able to work with Jack in opposing the forces of evil in Florida. That's because you're here among friends. Let's welcome Jack Thompson.
I have been on college campuses. I've even been on Donahue. And talk about needing protection. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact the most important speech I've ever given. Because I'm here in a way that I've never done before to expose an individual who wants to destroy the body of Christ in this nation, whose agenda is to destroy parental rights, to destroy the family, to destroy the Bill of Rights, to destroy everything that's good and decent in this country in the name of an administration that wouldn't know decency if it came up and bit it on the lip. I speak of Janet Reno. I'm not here as a Republican. I was so disgusted by the way the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee laid down and refused to allow the truth to be even heard about Janet Reno that I am no longer, ladies and gentlemen, a Republican. government the Founding Fathers understood must be as small as possible so that it invades little into our lives, but once it gets big, which it is now, incredibly big, if you just even look at the percentage of dollars that are taken by government, there's no stopping it. Janet Reno, for the last 12 years, has ruled South Florida, and she, more than any other single person in America, is responsible for what South Florida has become. You cannot trust the woman even about her own family history because it's a lie. She is a pathological liar. And let me tell you, as a lawyer who's been trained, and John knows this, in the libel and slander laws of this nation, of this state, and the state of Florida, I have welcomed Janet Reno to sue me about any of the things that I've said. And since I will be sending a copy of this tape to the Florida bar, let me be clear. Janet Reno categorically is a lesbian. I have talked to at least 25 separate sources about her lesbianism and the widely reputed rumor that one of her longtime lovers is an anchor person for ABC affiliate WPLG. Did you hear that, Lee? I was the first person visited by the FBI when they did their background check on Janet Reno after Bill Clinton nominated her to be Attorney General. They sat in my porch for about an hour and heard from me some of the following information. Here is the name of Crystal Kazim, a prostitute whose phone number is this, who is a cover girl in the South Florida Companion's Call Girl magazine, who claims to her publisher, Jay Goldstein, to have provided sex to Janet Reno for money in the house that Jane, her mother, built. Here is the name of Philip Buckman, a Metro-Dade police officer. Here's his badge number, who claims to have been in a stakeout in Sundays on the Bay restaurant on Key Biscayne. On a totally different matter, when in came Janet Reno, who proceeded to get falling down drunk, in his words, and proceeded to make out with another woman in a booth in the restaurant. I told the FBI about the radio talk show host in Fort Lauderdale by the name of Al Rantel, who was told by a Fort Lauderdale police officer, he maintained, that he came across Janet Reno in the backseat of a car after hours with an underage girl, both in a state of undress, in the parking lot of the Galleria Mall in Fort Lauderdale, engaged in sexual acts. And this police officer, Al Rantel, said, Janet Reno said, I'm Dade County State Attorney Janet Reno, and I would ask you to be discreet, and if you will be, I will do any favor I can for you in your jurisdiction. Janet Reno's never tried a case in her life, never been in a courtroom, ever. Ever. But let me tell you why, ladies and gentlemen, we shouldn't trust the Republican Party or any political party that now exists to deliver us from the harm that these evil people and this evil intended, powerful, dangerous government have in store for every single person in this room. And so I just want you to know that your loyal opposition on the Senate Judiciary Committee didn't even have the guts to discharge the advise and consent power of the Constitution, which is vested within the Senate, to confirm or not confirm by true and fair hearings every single cabinet official who's nominated by the President of the United States. And those men on that committee, both Republican and Democrat, know, they know that Janet Reno is a drunk driver. This is the same Senate, as you may recall, that denied John Tower the position of Secretary of Defense because he drank too much, supposedly. And yet they also know who the call girls' names are, who the officers' names are, and so forth, because I put it all in sworn statements to the Senate Judiciary Committee, but not one Republican had the guts to protect you or this nation, and that's why I say the Republican Party is not to be trusted. And frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that one reason why the Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee were willing to let someone they knew was dirty be the chief law enforcement officer in this nation is because they're dirty too. Crooks feel more comfortable when crooks are also the sheriffs. Janet Reno, before she had any thought of being Attorney General, addressed a group of B'nai B'rith and in a candid moment said, "My aim is to confiscate every single handgun, every single type of firearm from every citizen, criminal or law-abiding in this nation." A blatant shredding of the Second Amendment, the second article of the Bill of Rights. If anyone knows the history of Nazi Germany, they know that Hitler confiscated all the guns in order that the citizenry might be disarmed. And it's very clear when you read the Federalist Papers that the Founding Fathers understood that just as important as the First Amendment, maybe even more important, is the Second Amendment, and that is the right of the people to defend themselves against what would otherwise be an entity that had a monopoly on force.
Right now, we are very close to them accomplishing what they want. Very close. And I cannot emphasize that enough. With most of these actions, they have always looked at the prospect of disarming the American people first. It is the most important issue that we should concern ourselves with at this time. It should be noted that before they can do all of this, before they can perform any of the actions that are pending, they are going to have to take the weapons that we have inside the United States. I will say again, at the meeting that took place in 1989, the federal government and the representatives that were there stated uncategorically when we take the weapons, not if we take the weapons, but when. And under that premise, everything else was constructed. Now, very quickly, there's one that I like here, and I'm going to have it put up on the board while we're speaking. A little poster everybody should remember. All of those in favor of gun control, raise your right hand. There's an interesting piece that just came out that I was most fascinated with regards to firearms laws. It's a book concerning the Gun Control Act of 1968, in which it has been demonstrated that the Gun Control Act of 1968 wasn't simply an American creation. It was taken from Nazi Germany's gun control laws of 1938, word for word. Now that's very important when you consider this, because we're not talking a few paragraphs here and there. The entire document is taken from Nazi Germany's gun control laws of 1938.
You know, Hitler created one in Nazi Germany. And in 1938, he passed his Gun Control Act, which, by the way, is a carbon copy. America copied it in 1968. Some Jewish friends of mine, they're in an organization called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. They're conservative Jews. They said, Tex, we did research. We found out that Hitler's 1938 Gun Control Act is word for word the same as America's 1968 Gun Control Act. We found out that it was Senator Thomas Dodd who introduced this act, and he was a member of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. He knew all about the Nazi Gun Control Act. He must have liked it a lot. They found out in going to the Library of Congress of the United States that Senator Dodd, when developing this legislation, had requested that the Library of Congress obtain a copy of the Nazi Gun Control Act and translate it into English and provide it his office. And then it was passed as America's Gun Control Act of 1968. How does it feel to be living under Nazi rule today in America? Isn't that amazing? Amazing story.
Not long ago, we received a telephone call on the G. Gordon Liddy show from a young woman who called herself Susan. And she identified herself, and we subsequently confirmed she was a lawyer on the staff of the President of the United States. And Susan proceeded to tell me how uneducated you all are, those of you who listen to me. She proceeded to tell us how strange you are. And from her perspective, you are strange, uneducated, and dangerous because you dare to think for yourself. You see, the Susans of this world, the Bill and Hillary Clintons of this world, believe you incapable. You don't have the brains, you don't have the education to think for yourself correctly, properly. They will do it for you. And you had better not object. Because if you object, you have before you the vision of women and children being gassed and burnt to death, of women holding their babies being shot through the head by snipers, your dogs being shot, your cats being stomped to death, your children running for the house shot to death in the back. But that's all right, because those people were not mainstream as defined by Bill and Hillary Clinton and the Susans of this world. Now, the one thing that causes them to tremble, the one thing that keeps them up at night, trying to pass new laws, goading the media into attacking you, the one thing is that you have guns. You have guns the way they had guns in the colonial days. And our British masters did not like that. And so they sent the military after those guns at Concord. That's what they were looking for, you know, they were going for, to take away the guns, the powder, the ball. And guess who stood in the way? The militia, that's who stood in the way. Now, in the terms of the United States Constitution, every man and woman of you capable of bearing arms is the militia. Every one. But of course, there are also organized militias. And at Concord, it was an organized militia called the Minutemen. And they shot back. And we have our country today because of it. Now, I have been criticized by my dear friends in the press for suggesting that when some, and they are very few, thank God, bad, corrupt law enforcement officers, BATF, FBI HRT, not the real FBI, the cowboys, if they come smashing into your house in the middle of the night, no warning, shooting, you've got a choice, haven't you? You can lawfully die, or you can constitutionally live. Now, I don't know about you, but on the list of those who are supposed to die, there are so many people before we get to me that... All right. What does this mean? What this means is you don't do something stupid and atrocious like Oklahoma City. What you do is what you're doing here today. You see to it that there are even more people next year. And in between, my friends, you do something called use the multiplier effect. Now, that's a military term. And it means that every one of you, with sufficient dedication, and I think everybody who's here has it, you've demonstrated that, bombarding your senators and your members of the House of Representatives and your state assemblymen, senators and the rest of it, and your governors. And you tell them, we know that we will have this free country so long as we have our guns, because our guns make it possible for us to keep it free. The militia, you know, are not organizing, those various militias are not organizing to proactively go after the government. They are organizing to try to get the government to leave them alone. That's what the American people want from government. Leave us alone. Now, you know, a hornet's nest is kind of like that, isn't it? They're up there doing their thing. And if you've got the sense that God gave a load of gravel, you don't screw around with a hornet's nest. Well, unfortunately, because the man hasn't got a clue, Bill Clinton has stirred up a hornet's nest. Dianne Feinstein has stirred up a hornet's nest. Now, the Constitution is absolutely crystal clear. Any purported law which infringes upon your right to keep and bear arms, any arms of your choice, is unconstitutional. Just don't obey the damn law. They're not going to put 100 million Americans in jail. They want to disarm you. Refuse to be disarmed.
Because the only reason that they feel that they can take this is because not enough of people are thinking about how to use this. Coercive force in the hands of the people prevents tyranny. Tyranny. A word you will learn again and again and again.
Let me make sure that you understand I'm not here representing the NRA. I'm not even a member. Okay? Secondly, I'd like to say that in your opening statements, you commented specifically on my testimony, saying that basically it had nothing to do with this issue. And I had to chuckle because then I noticed you had Mr. Brady up here, who was hit not with an assault weapon, but with a .22 caliber revolver. So getting beyond that, I didn't grow up in a house with guns. I don't hunt. I personally abhor hunting. But I was given a gun by a friend when I was 21 to carry in my purse for self-defense, and I was taught how to use it. A couple of years ago, my parents and I went to a cafeteria in Texas on a bright sunny day. We weren't in a dark alley where we weren't supposed to be. And as you all know the story, this madman drove his truck through the window. And he began shooting. Well, immediately, my father and I got down on the floor and put the table up in front of us. And this guy kept shooting. And you're thinking, well, you know, what could it be? Is it a robbery? That's the first thing that generally comes to mind. And he keeps shooting. It took me a good 45 seconds to realize that this man wasn't there to commit a robbery. He wasn't there for a hit. He was there to simply shoot as many people as he possibly could. Now, I'd like to make something clear. I hear all this talk about how many bullets can go in a clip. I've been there. I can tell you it doesn't matter. It takes 1 second to switch out a clip. You can have 1 bullet or 100 bullets. It doesn't matter, guys. I've been there. He goes, dump, dump. Just like that. That's not enough time to rush a man. I promise you. When I finally realized what was occurring, I thought, I got him. And I reached for my purse. He was maybe 12 feet away. You know, is it possible my gun could have jammed? Sure. Is it possible I could have missed? Sure. But I can tell you I've hit much smaller targets at much greater distances. But then I realized that a couple of months earlier I had made the stupidest decision of my life. I took my gun out of my purse and left it in my car. Because as you well know, in the state of Texas, it's sometimes a felony offense to carry a gun in your purse. I can tell you that I'm not mad at the guy that did this. As he continued, it was obvious that he was a madman. My father, at that point, said, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. He's going to kill everybody in here, and he rushed the man. No way. The guy turned, shot him in the chest. He went down, was obviously mortally wounded. For whatever reason, that made the man change directions and go off to my left. Shortly thereafter, someone at the back of the restaurant broke out a window. When I saw what looked like an opportunity to escape, I turned around and I grabbed my mother by the shirt and I said, come on, we've got to run, we've got to get out of here. And then my feet grew wings and I was out the back window. As soon as I got out, I realized that my mother had not followed me out. And as I learned from the police officers, she had crawled over to where my father was and cradled him until the guy got back around to her, put the gun to her head. She looked up at him, put her head down, and he pulled the trigger. My parents had just had their 47th wedding anniversary. She wasn't going anywhere. As I mentioned, I'm not really mad at the guy that did this. And I'm certainly not mad at the guns that did this. They didn't walk in there by themselves and pull their own triggers. The guy that did it was a lunatic. That's like being mad at a rabid dog. I'm mad at my legislators for legislating me out of the right to protect myself and my family. I would much rather be sitting in jail with a felony offense on my head and have my parents alive. As far as these so-called assault weapons, you say that they don't have any defense use. You tell that to the guy that I saw on a videotape of the LA riots, standing up on his rooftop, protecting his property and his life from an entire mob with one of these so-called assault weapons. Tell me that he didn't have a legitimate self-defense use. Just one final statement. I've been sitting here getting more and more fed up with all of this talk about these pieces of machinery having no legitimate sporting purpose, no legitimate hunting purpose. People, that is not the point of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is not about duck hunting. And I know I'm not going to make very many friends saying this, but it's about our right, all of our right, to be able to protect ourselves from all of you guys up there.
Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
We could get you a list a mile long. There's patriots that come on and tell it like it is. J.P. McCarthy is another one that gets on there and tells it like it is. I remember this one casual time he got Gus Hall on, and J.P. said to Gus Hall, he says, Gus, don't you get tired of losing? Because Gus was running for president on the Communist Party ticket. And Gus turned to him and he said, J.P., what makes you think we're losing? He said, we've implemented every plank of the Communist Manifesto. We just haven't got the guns from the people yet. And J.P. turned to him and said, yeah, and you ain't going to get them from the people. What do you think of that? Well, folks, what do you think of that? They're working on it, aren't they?
In case you didn't know, I am Sheriff Richard Mack from Arizona. Who should keep the keys? What do you think that's talking about? Who should keep the keys? This is Time magazine, folks. The United States government, this is the subtitle. The United States government wants the power to tap into every phone, fax, and computer transmission. We have such tremendous examples of stupidity in this country going on today, and last May 30th, I appeared on the Donahue Show with Sheriff Prince from Montana, who also won his case against the federal government in fighting the Brady bill. And we were on with Sarah Brady and Richard Aborn of Handgun Control Incorporated. And at one point in the show, there were several scary comments made on the show. But one scary thought, at one point, Phil Donahue stopped and went to in front of Sarah Brady, and he says, "Now, you wouldn't in any way be trying or attempting to take away the American freedom to choose to have guns. You're not trying to take that away from people, are you?" And she goes, and some of you saw this earlier, and she says, "No, well, I wouldn't put it exactly that way." You're not a kid, and she wouldn't put it exactly that way. There are already over 20,000 gun control laws in this country. No one can point to any one of them that ever reduced a single crime rate in this country. No one can do that. They cannot. Even they cannot. All they say is, well, the failure of those gun control laws just proves we need more. We have got to get really strict. Yeah. And not only that, I was watching Richard Aborn on CNN as he challenged Richard Gardner of the NRA about the gun control movement. And then a liberal commentator on CNN, and I don't know which one it was. It's not one that's on a lot. This isn't Crossfire. This was another debate. And this guy actually said, this commentator, a news person on national television said, and I watched it myself, he says, "You're right, gun control has failed. What we need is every police officer in this country to go in every home and take away guns." It's already being proposed. If you don't think that this is only the beginning of disarmament, you've got your head buried in the sand, friends. This is exactly what it is. And the book asks the same question. After 20,000 failed gun control laws, just what do you think this is only the beginning of? When they signed the Brady bill into law, Sarah Brady and Bill Clinton and some of these others, Schumers and Metzenbaums and some of these others, promised that this was only the beginning. Friends, it's time to wake up. I have never been a member of the NRA. I am not a gun advocate. I am not a hunter, and I could care less whether you get to go hunting or not. And so could the Founding Fathers. And if any of you think that the Founding Fathers, while they were formulating the freest country in the world and formulating a document to set standards by which that government would be ruled and governed, government being governed, it's a very important issue, that they stopped after ensuring freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom to peaceably assemble, and the freedom to file grievances against the government. If you think that they stopped and said, okay, time out, we now need to stop and guarantee the people of this country the right to go hunting. And I'm going to tell you something else, and I don't pretend in any way, shape, manner, or form to be a founding father or even compared to those men at all. Not even close, and I mean that. But I will tell you, after the studies that I have done and the research I have done, and after I have gotten to know such men as Patrick Henry, I know, and I know that if they were here today, they would have me or you and everyone else understand and know this one order from them. And so I will take the liberty and the license, if you will, to issue you an order. And I mean this in the name of the Founding Fathers. Don't you ever, any of you, within the reach of my voice, don't any of you ever turn the safety of yourself or your family over to the government, and don't you ever turn your weapons of war or any other guns over to the government. Ever.
There are things going on in our country that are absolutely horrifying when you think in terms of, you know, it was bad enough the government was out to ban all guns. They want to go after handguns and then assault weapons, and they want to, you know, to basically disarm America. Just as in any other communist country, you've got to disarm the people first before you can impose total tyranny.
Well, the big question, of course, is when you're talking about how far back it goes. As I mentioned, we have documents back 40 years. In 1961, an interesting thing took place. In 61, there was literally several meetings put together at a high-level national security level, as well as meetings with the United Nations. And in 61, there was an agreement for a 30-year, three-part plan. As you can see here with this, this picture that you see now, this is directly taken from the National Security Summary for the year of 61. And we are at the very bottom of that plan for the 30 years. And if you can see on the paperwork here, it points out and says, calls for the disarmament of the United Nations, or excuse me, of the United States under the UN control, and it shows that all arms now, at the end of this 30-year time, would be strictly in the hands of the law enforcement agencies and the United Nations one world government.
Well, what's interesting is this little document in here, which, strangely enough, your State Department just doesn't want to provide anymore. 7277. The abolishment and disarming of the United States. This is a State Department document. It was amended several times, and there were several other documents that extend beyond it. But it gives the agenda and the program involved for the disarmament and the abolishment of these United States. The program has not changed, and as somebody came up to us and said, you know, if you look at this, we're in phase 2, aren't we? Yeah, we're in phase 2, and there's only 3 phases. They have been exceptionally successful in, for instance, eliminating most of our manufacturing capabilities. Some of the most recent variations on this, the American arms industry has 53 specific arms plants that will be closed down over the next 2 months. These 53 plants will not have their factory materiel sold, but rather it will be cut up and destroyed, a total of 18,000 pieces of machinery. Rather than selling these to the open market and creating some form of revenue in return for the physical resources that were available, they will be destroyed at a great cost to the American taxpayer.
This is another one of their dirty documents. The United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. This was released the same month by the printing office that President Kennedy made that statement. For sale by the Superintendent of Documents, U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, 25, D.C. Freedom from War. This is inside that the context of that book. It talks about the disbanding of all national armed forces and the prohibition, like in No-No, of their reestablishment in any form whatsoever, other than those required to preserve internal order and for contributions to a United Nations peace force. The third stage of this development program, which we're in the middle of right now, talks about manpower for a UN peace force. It talks about the manufacture of armaments would be prohibited, except all other armaments would be destroyed or converted to peaceful purposes. This is out of the Billings Gazette, Tuesday, May 24th, 1994. The UN begins work for global gun control? I don't think so. This document is the same basic document that they've already done Canada with. For instance, 5 years ago, if you'd have registered your Barrett Light 50, you'd be having it chopped up today, or you'd be in prison. So much for registering. Communists have said for many years, register firearms under any pretext as a preload to confiscating them. Is this proof for what? Now this is some of the twisted logic in front of the UN building, New York, New York. This statue of a revolver with a twist in it, in the barrel, like a pretzel, is 3 foot by 6 foot bronze sculpture in the front yard of the UN building. But they have no sinister designs, right? Now, to lead on a little further, this is the Constitution that we'll be going by, if they get their way. Constitution for the Federation of Earth. I believe we have copies with us downstairs. They talk about a world democracy, the rational alternative.
Here it is. This is the Constitution for the world government. It is being called, tentatively at least, a Constitution for the Federation of Earth. Sounds like something out of Star Trek, doesn't it? It's almost laughable, but it's really happening. Their proposed name for the world government at this time is the Federation of Earth. So they're moving closer and closer on this. I want to read to you just one excerpt out of this World Constitution to give you an idea of the kind of people we're dealing with here. Article 10, Section D of the World Constitution states, and this deals with the means of enforcement, how they would force the world government upon us if we don't willingly go along with it. And I quote, "Non-military means of enforcement which can be developed may include denial of financial credit, denial of material resources and personnel, revocation of licenses, charters, or corporate rights." And then they go on to say imprisonment or isolation and other means appropriate to the specific situations. Now, this is clearly not a democratic effort. I don't care what anybody tells me. Also, on the back page of this Constitution, the United Nations logo is very prominently displayed. So again, this organization is a type of further offshoot or development of the United Nations. They will not admit that. They would probably argue against that, but the evidence points to that. The same people who took us into the League of Nations and then the United Nations, which was intended really to be a limited form of world government, to condition the American people to receive a world government, they are now ready to take us the final step all the way into a full-blown world government. If you're not listening now, I don't believe you would listen if Jesus Christ himself stood up here and told you this. We've got to wake up. The documentation is here, and I believe we don't have a lot of time.
Now, even the Reader's Digest is getting a little upset with what's going on with the UN. They really picked good letters for the UN because the UN is un-American. The United Nations is out of control. Why would they say such a thing?
Thank you, Paul, Hal, Pastor Cersei, ladies and gentlemen. Delight to be here on a very mean night out there, I guess we could say. Our subject tonight is going to be the United Nations and the United States military. But anyhow, I wanted to establish what we believe in the John Birch Society. We believe very strongly in what the founders gave us. Now, I said we're going to talk about the United Nations, so let me contrast. We'll contrast the United Nations with the United States. And we start off very simply by saying that at the United Nations there is no God. There is no mention of God. There never has been any mention of God. And therefore, the United Nations' attitude regarding rights is not that they come from God. They never really do say where they come from. They want you to presume that the United Nations or some government gave them to you. In 1966, the United Nations published the International Covenants on Human Rights. I've been carrying this booklet around with me for many years. You can see it's getting a little bit soiled. Now, one of the covenants in this United Nations document is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are actually 3 in the booklet. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been labeled the equivalent of the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution because it talks about the same kinds of rights. However, it doesn't start off with the premise that the rights come from God. So let's see how the United Nations treats these rights. I will read to you from Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations. It says, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? Where did it come from? They didn't say. And 2 paragraphs later, they say this: freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. In other words, they retain power to cancel the right that they've even talked about. If a right can be prescribed by law, I assure you it will be. And over again, the United Nations says the same thing. The next Article 19, everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. And then it says, the exercise of the right provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law. Article 21, the right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions shall be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law. On and on we go. Here's your right, but we retain the power to construct a law to drive that right out of existence. That is exactly parallel to the Constitution of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. And you know how many rights the people enjoyed there. The United States and the United Nations are totally incompatible. If you get back to the fundamentals of our country, you see that the fundamentals of the United Nations are totally different. We don't want that. We in the John Birch Society would like more Americans to appreciate the great heritage we were given by brave and far-seeing individuals over 200 years ago who constructed this nation and built it on a very sound foundation. Now let's move ahead here. We want to talk about a lot of events in the 20th century, and I like to characterize the 20th century and most of its major events as a progression towards total world government. I think most of the major events of the 20th century occurred because there were people behind the scenes making them happen in order to bring about more government and world government. In December of 1990, there were two senators, Senator Paul Simon, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of this. Senator Paul Simon of Illinois and Senator George Mitchell of Maine had just gone off to Saudi Arabia and visited 500,000 American military people making preparations for war. This was December of 1990. The war against Iraq started on January 17th, 1991. So this was only a couple of weeks before the war. They came back from it. They went and visited with Mr. Bush in the White House. They pleaded with him to negotiate further with Saddam Hussein, or to give economic sanctions more time to work, or to do whatever else he could to avoid the bloodshed that they had every reason to expect in the weeks ahead. I'm sure you recall, as I certainly do myself, the predictions of many, many casualties coming out of there when Saddam Hussein's crack army was going to be a problem for us. But George Bush said to the two senators the following: "Let me give you this final message. If we use the military, we can make the United Nations a really meaningful, effective voice for peace and stability in the future. Consider that. If we use the military, we can build the United Nations." That was his goal. It had very little to do with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. His goal, as he said over and over again, was to reinvigorate the United Nations, to build the United Nations, and so forth. He eventually gave the order, and the war began. He wasn't retaliating for aggression against our nation. There wasn't any. He wasn't about to send our troops into battle to protect American lives and property. None had been attacked, and none were threatened. It wasn't his intention to order American forces into the Iraq-Kuwait confrontation in order to defend an ally to whom we were treaty-bound, because we had no such treaty with Kuwait. Our nation's forces should never have been involved in this fight between Arab neighbors. But why did he do it? He told those two senators, and Senator Paul Simon put those remarks in the congressional record. George Bush said he would use the military to make the United Nations look good. And he did. And soon afterwards, the next issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, the premier world government promoters in our day, to which Mr. Bush owes allegiance for his many years of membership, they came out with their next issue, and they did something quite unusual. They had a 4-page unsigned editorial at the beginning of the magazine. It's the first time I've ever seen that. And here's what it said. It said, never before in American history was there a period quite like it. For 48 days, the United States moved inexorably toward war, acting on authority granted by an international organization. What did Mr. Clinton do? He's now in office. He pulled out some of our forces, but then he put 4,000 American combat troops under the command of a Turkish general named Servik Bir. The first time in our nation's history that U.S. combat forces were forced to serve under anyone but an American. Another step into the United Nations web. In September 1994, President Clinton sent tens of thousands of our nation's troops to Haiti to enforce another UN resolution. 11 months before that deployment, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina sought to amend the Defense Appropriation Act to bar any allocation of funds for military action in Haiti unless Congress approved such action after it received written certification from the President that it was necessary to protect and evacuate American citizens. The Helms Amendment was defeated in the Senate 83-19. Now, excuse me, that can't be. That's 102. 81-19 it was. So here we have another step. You see, precedents being made all along the way. There were some people who went to President Clinton and said, where are you getting the authority to send troops into Haiti? Listen to what he said. I would welcome the support of Congress, and I hope that I might have it, but like my predecessors of both parties, I have not agreed that I was constitutionally mandated to get it. Well, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says Congress shall declare war. The founding fathers tell us that the president is the commander-in-chief, but that is an assignment of responsibility. It is not a grant of power. And then, acting on another precedent established during the operation in Somalia, Mr. Clinton directed the United States forces to replace Haiti's leader and to disarm the civilian population. Now, in an age when precedents are swiftly relied upon to justify additional action, the United Nations' newly adopted role of choosing national leaders and disarming civilians constitutes a threat to the independence of any nation, certainly including ours. Might we ever get to a point where United Nations troops are sent to America while our own military are stationed in Germany and in the Middle East and in Japan and in Korea and every place else in order to disarm the American people and to replace our leaders? Well, the precedent is there. I hope to God it never happens. The purpose of our military is to protect the lives and the property of the people of this country. That's it. We have a new category now of reason for our military. It's to defend the vital interests of the United States. Is that defined anywhere? No. It could be anything. That's exactly what Mr. Clinton said when he sent troops into Haiti. And it was ludicrous. The vital interests of the United States in Haiti, there were none. But what was the real purpose? The real purpose was to increase the clout of the United Nations. Well, NATO was created. Troops were sent to Europe to be a part of the defense of Western Europe. This is a form of foreign aid. It costs us hundreds of billions of dollars to defend the nations of Western Europe. We also defend Korea. We defend Japan. We have them in the Middle East. We have them in Somalia. We have them in Macedonia. I read recently where they had just come back from Colombia. I didn't even know they were there. They're everywhere. And the John Birch Society says very simply, all of this is wrong. It's unnecessary. Bring the troops home. Bring them all home tomorrow. And whenever I say that, there's always someone who said, oh, you're an isolationist. And I say, no, I'm a non-interventionist. I like to put it in those terms. I believe that people-to-people contacts are progress, and government-to-government contacts are usually treachery. Who's running the show here? The United States or the United Nations? The Bush administration did nothing to challenge this outrageous UN policy that amounted to another small but significant step away from national sovereignty. In May 1994, President Clinton awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously to 2 American soldiers killed during the bungled military mission in Somalia. The 2 American soldiers were dead. Their parents came to the ceremony. Mr. Herbert Shugart, the father of an Army sergeant who perished trying to rescue a downed helicopter pilot, refused to shake the president's hand when presented with his dead son's medal. He said to the president, "You are not fit to be president of the United States. The blame for my son's death rests with the White House and you. You are not fit to command." And you know that story appeared in only one American newspaper? And that one American newspaper got the story from a British newspaper. President Gore happened to be in Africa during the time of the tragedy when an American plane shot down some American helicopters patrolling in Iraq. This was the friendly fire tragedy. And so he commented about it while in Africa, and he extended, quote, "condolences to the families of those who died in the service of the United Nations." United Nations? Does the United Nations already control the U.S. military? Well, I don't think so totally, but I'm not sure. What are we facing here, my friends? What we're facing is a conspiracy. We're not facing a conspiracy that's headquartered in Moscow. We're not facing a conspiracy that's even headquartered at the United Nations. We're facing a conspiracy that has a grip on our government and on our media and on our educational system. In 1956, J. Edgar Hoover, then the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wrote an article that appeared in the Elks magazine, and he said this. He said, "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists." Isn't that the case with Americans today? Now, I'm not claiming that J. Edgar Hoover's view of this conspiracy is the same as my own, but he certainly believed that there was a conspiracy. And he said it was so vast and so monstrous that most people can't even begin to believe it exists. Well, happily in our country today, many, many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are beginning to realize that it does exist. And we can't present you with the leader of it. We can't tell you that they meet in this building. We can tell you all about subsidiary parts of it that we believe. We can pretty much lay a mountain of evidence on anyone about a conspiracy that is taking over our country and stealing away our liberties. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's overwhelming. And what we ask you to do is to take a look at it. Take a look at some of our books. One of the best is this one, The Shadows of Power, The History of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think that book demonstrates the conspiracy theory of history, which really isn't a theory, it's a fact, in my view. It does it probably as well as anybody. But let me give you one piece of evidence about this conspiracy, and then you can help to decide for yourself. One of my colleagues who preceded me at the podium here mentioned this State Department document, 7277. It's called Freedom from War, and it was published in 1961. It was published by the State Department. It was brought to the United Nations by President John Kennedy. It is the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. And he went and he spoke at the United Nations in September of 1961, presented this document as the fixed and determined policy of the government of the United States. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a three-step program supposed to take many years, and of course it is taking many years. leading to the United States disarming itself and turning over our military to the United Nations. Very simply. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is here, and that's been accomplished. The treaty to ban the use of outer space for nuclear weapons is in this document. That's happened. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, several other treaties that have been made with other nations are all part of this thing. You read through it and you say, well, yeah, that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and how close are we towards the end? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're very close to the end. So let me read to you what it says at the end. It says, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. It says states would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. It says the manufacture of armaments would be prohibited, except for those agreed types and quantities to be used by the United Nations. Is this program still in effect? Well, this is as it was published. It then became known as the Basic Provisions for Disarmament. They put a change on it, but they said in the new document that it was simply an updating and an expanding of the original, so we still use the original. But it was only about 18 months ago, I think, I called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in Washington, and I asked to speak to somebody who could tell me about the history of this document, and they put me in touch with a Dr. William Nary, and Dr. Nary confirmed to me that, yes, this program is still in effect and it is still being carried out. Now, if we turn over our military to the United Nations, they will then become subject to the military commander at the United Nations. At the founding, it was agreed that the Soviet Union would always get to appoint the person who holds this post. And so there have been 17 hold the post in the history of the United Nations, and they've all been communists. They just recently split the post. They now have an African who is in charge of that for Africa and South America, but a Russian ex-communist, now they call him, is in charge for our part of the world. Where are we? Let's realize something. The United Nations is not taking us over. What is happening is our own leaders are using the United Nations to take us over for them. The problem isn't in New York at the United Nations. The problem is in Washington, D.C., in our government. If the United States would not be doing what it is doing for the United Nations would be going nowhere. Practically everything that's happened in the 20th century has given impetus toward a world government. Do we want a world government? No. No. Putting all power in any repository is suicidal. Don't do it. Independent nations are a good thing. Yes, some of them will be led by evil people. Some of them will do evil things. But the kind of people who are evil and arise in power in some nations are exactly the kind of people who will gravitate to head the world government. We don't want that. We don't want to scrap the Declaration of Independence. We don't want to give up the Constitution of the United States. What we want instead is for our leaders to stand by their oath to it. And so we must get out of the United Nations. If enough people in this nation can be given the full truth about the United Nations and its many high-level promoters, certainly including our President, our Secretary of State, our cabinet officials, our media, a lot of our professors, foundations, and so forth. If enough people in this country can be given the full truth about the UN and these promoters, instead of the constant stream of pro-UN propaganda, the people of this nation will see to it that their representatives in Congress take action to get us out. George Washington once said that truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains taken to bring it to light. Pains must be taken by many more Americans if this nation is to remain free. Will you help? You folks who are before me, you folks who are hearing this on television, will you help? Daniel Webster has frequently been quoted as saying, "There is nothing so powerful as truth, and often nothing so strange." It may seem strange, but it is true that the peace organization is a war organization, that its vaunted claim to be a fountain of justice is in this mean and vindictive world is a hoax, and that its protestations of protecting human rights and enhancing human freedoms are demonstrable lies. It is also true that the greatest promoters of the UN world domination and the most important enemies of U.S. sovereignty serve in leadership posts of this nation. The UN could not survive for long without the support of top officials of the United States of America. It is they who intend to have the UN that they will control rule the world. And they will countenance treason, lying, killing, and any foul means imaginable to accomplish their goal. We borrow the words of the Lord himself when we say to fellow Americans, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." What we have presented is truth. It must be disseminated widely and acted upon as if one's life depended on it, because it does. Very simply and very directly. If enough truth reaches enough Americans, they will choose new leaders who will withdraw this nation from the UN, rebuild our armed forces, and ensure that our military serves nothing but this nation. If enough good people decide to join the ever-growing army of patriotic Americans dedicated to exposing and routing this conspiracy in our midst, then America will remain a bastion of freedom for ourselves and for the children of today and tomorrow. And so we ask you again, will you help? Your help is needed, and needed now. Will you give it? Our recommendation is simple. Contact the John Birch Society and get started in the vitally important work of saving this nation from a United Nations type of world. Right here in the front, Joe.
Yeah, Jack, what is the definition given as given in the document there? Do you think of enough of a military force to maintain internal order? What do you mean by that?
Well, I've analyzed that, and that's part of the book. What they're talking about there is the creation of a national police force, and that, of course, will also be under UN control. So you will maintain internal order with an internal police force under their control, and then you will maintain order in the world with the United Nations Peace Force that will impose the United Nations will. That's what they mean by it, because it's not a disarmament program as much as it is a weapons distribution program. See, they talk about disarmament, but they're not disarming themselves. They're disarming everybody else, and they want the United Nations to remain armed. So it's not a disarmament program, it's a distribution program. The United States is still a wonderful place. Much of what we believe in is still here, and of course the Constitution still stands, which is why there is so many people talking today about let's have a constitutional convention to get rid of it. We certainly don't want that. So we can hold their feet to the fire. We can say to them, you've taken an oath to that. You either stand by the oath or we'll get somebody else. And that's the way we mean to change the situation here. We don't want force of arms ourselves. We have no intention of doing that. Sir, a question?
I'd like to ask you a question in reference to these base closings.
Yes.
Is this all part of the...
disarmament, yes.
It's part of the disarmament plan.
Yes, I was on a radio show recently, and a fellow called up and he said, what do you think about these base closings? I said, well, they're closing the wrong bases. Ladies and gentlemen, let me wind this up with another little dramatic piece of evidence, I guess you could say. In May of this last year, May 1994, we got a letter from a young Marine stationed at the 29 Palms Marine Corps base in California. This is his letter. This is what he sent us, this material. And he gave us his name, and he said he's on active duty, and he had just been ordered to participate in a survey conducted by a Navy lieutenant commander among the troops on the base. And he was so furious after this survey that he came outside and he was talking to some of his fellow Marines about it, and he was just wild, and they were as well. And he said to him, he said, I wish I had a copy of that. I know where I could send it. And the guy said, well, they gave me two, and I brought one out here. So he sent it right to us. All right, it's a combat arms survey, and it asks the Marines to respond to all kinds of scenarios that are painted. Do you strongly agree? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you strongly disagree? Or do you not have any opinion? Check it off, and so forth. All right. So these are all attitudes. It's all about different roles for the service, and then it gets into the United States runs a field training exercise. UN combat troops should be allowed to serve in U.S. combat units during these exercises under U.S. command. Do you agree, disagree, or something? It's starting to get a little bit heavy at this point. The United Nations runs a field training exercise. U.S. combat troops should serve under UN command and control during these exercises. Do you agree, strongly disagree, and so forth? I feel that the President of the United States has the authority to pass his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief to the UN Secretary General. Do you agree, disagree, or what? I feel there is no conflict between my oath and serving as a UN soldier. I would swear to the following code. I am a United Nations fighting person. I serve in the forces which maintain world peace and every nation's way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. You see, it's getting on and on. It's prepping young Marines for United Nations control. And then the last question, listen to this one. The U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for these firearms to be turned over to local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizen groups refuse to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement. I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse or resist confiscation of firearms banned by the United States government. The United States Marines at 29 Palms Base in California were required to participate in that survey, and the young fellow who sent it to us, I've talked to him on the telephone, he said he didn't know of any one of them who wasn't really furious about it, which I'm certainly glad to hear. But the fact that they would allow it says something. Why would they allow that? Well, he sent us as well a copy of the base newspaper. In the 29 Palms base newspaper, there was an article about the Council on Foreign Relations visiting the base. The general was just delighted. He was showing the Council on Foreign Relations all around. He helicoptered them all over the base. And then, of course, if you look deeply into it, you see that the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations as well, as is the head of the Air Force and the head of the Army. And in the past 15, 20 years, almost all members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our military is being undermined from within. And a lot of those men don't even realize how they themselves are being used. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a big job ahead of us. We've got a wonderful country to save. I think it can be done. Education is our strategy, and truth is our only weapon. Please help us. Thank you very much.
John McManus has been the spokesperson for the John Birch Society since 1973. He has served as president of the organization since 1991.
We have a variety of different regimes, all of them with ambitions, but none of them are as ambitious as this core of people that are facing us right now. With the documents, and there are copies of this here, and I highly recommend that you get it. First of all, it's a New American. But anyway, on the cover are the people that you're going to be facing. Some of them American, but they're going to have that blue helmet on. They have denounced their American citizenship and are now aligned with the New World Order. In some ways, I'm thankful of that because at least I know where they stand. And I would rather have a good enemy to my front than a bad friend to my rear. Keep that in mind when you organize. Better to know where everybody stands.
We're here today are observing an absolutely historic event. The soldiers that you see before you represent not the past, but rather the future. It is through exercises such as this that truly we can create a new world order.
So how do they get our military boys to go along with this? This is the Army War College, Washington, D.C. This is what they're teaching our troops now, our officers, our leaders. Peacemaking, peacekeeping, and coalition warfare. The future role of the United Nations. This is taught right in our own colleges here in America. It's Norwich University. Inside of that document, the reference page, and we have the whole book on it. United Nations peacekeeping, relationship between civilian and military components. Folks, it's all going to be Force 2000. There's not going to be military, there's not going to be police, they'll all be the same.
The disarming of the American people via gun control. Okay, the DeConcini bill will probably be passed in the next couple of months. There are probably 100 million Americans, 75 to 100 million Americans that have close to 200 million guns. When they start going after the guns, it's going to be probably as nasty as it is in Waco, Texas, or has been in the last month or so, because there's a lot of people that simply won't turn in their guns. The Constitution guarantees us the right to own and bear firearms. They're going to go after the guns without even nailing the Constitution yet. U.S. military and National Guard personnel have been undergoing training and exercises for several years for house-to-house searches, presumably for drugs or guns, for crowd control, or for domestic counterterrorism measures.